Okay, let's get started. Good morning again. This is Jeannie Lee. I'm the Chief Counsel with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We're thrilled that you could join us today for the CEQA 202 series. I am going to introduce our new staff counsel here at the Strategic Growth Council. His name is Matt Reed. He is moderating today's panel, and I'm going to hand it off to him.
Thanks, Jeannie, and good morning, everyone. Excited to be here and to join the SGC team. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. We are going to be using the Q&A function for questions. So if there's any issues coming up, please use the Q&A function. We're actually going to have the chat function turned off for attendees. And with that, I wanted to introduce the presenters and the panelists this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Jeannie Lee, Chief Counsel at OPR. Will be taking the lead on this presentation, as well as Natalie Kuffel, who is Land Use Counsel at OPR. And joining us today is Jennifer Holman, attorney with the Housing Community Development Agency. So also on is Alyssa Montanez, who is providing technical support, and she'll be helping manage the Q&A portion and generally making this run smoothly. So we will go on to the next slide. So this is the second video in the CEQA 202 series, and today the focus is on exemptions to CEQA. The first video in the series went over what constitutes a project for purposes of CEQA. There's actually a link that will be provided to that first video, and it was, I think, really informative. It sounds like there was a lot of really good feedback about the video, and a number of attendees coming over who have been part of both. So this is the second in the series, and with that, we will go to the third slide, which is kind of bringing some context. Where are we in the CEQA process, and why are we presenting this piece? So once a public agency determines that an activity is a project, CEQA evaluation is required unless it's determined that an exemption applies. So we determined whether it's a project in the first presentation. Now we're looking at exemptions. This presentation is going to most fully explore categorical and statutory exemptions, but for introductory purposes, we recognize that there are four kind of broad exemption categories. For ministerial projects, kind of the common sense exemption, and then the two that we'll be focusing on today, statutory exemptions and categorical. Want to direct people, if you want to learn more or if you missed the first presentation, that first video actually covered the ministerial discretionary exemption at about 27 minutes into the video. So there's some really good discussion on kind of that determination. We won't be going into that as much today. Again, we're looking at categorical and statutory exemptions and using kind of housing as a framework to look at that. So with that, I'd like to kick it back over to Jeannie for what's next.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And I also want to give a special thank you to Jennifer Holman of HCD for joining us for this webinar. Again, my name is Jeannie Lee. I'm with OPR. Matt did a really great job of setting up the focus for today's webinar, which is going to be on CEQA exemptions. So I'm going to start with a very high-level overview of exemptions before Jennifer and Natalie get into the details. Next slide, please. What are CEQA exemptions? What does it mean to be exempt from CEQA? Well, when we're talking about an activity being exempt, functionally it means that an activity would not be subject to the CEQA process at all. The agency would not have to prepare an initial study and do any further CEQA documentation that may be required as an outcome of the initial study process, such as a negative declaration or an EIR. So from the outset, when an agency is considering what CEQA path is appropriate for that proposed activity, the agencies should determine whether there are any exemptions from CEQA that might apply. But just as a caution, just because something is exempt under CEQA, that doesn't mean that the agency is exempt from meeting the requirements and complying with other environmental laws that may apply, such as the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Air Act. So all other applicable environmental laws would continue to apply. Next slide, please. There are three buckets of exemptions. First, there are statutory exemptions. The legislature has exempted different kinds of projects from CEQA because CEQA is statutory by nature. The legislature has the power to create these exemptions from CEQA. So in creating them, the legislature has determined that the exempt activities represent interests that are important enough to justify not doing environmental review. The next type of exemptions are categorical exemptions, and they're called categorical because they reflect classes of projects that the Natural Resources Agency has determined are exempt per se, because these projects do not have a significant effect on the environment. And finally, there is the common sense exemption. So if a project doesn't fall within either the statutory or categorical exemptions, agencies may want to consider whether the activity falls within the common sense exemption. The operative words here are certainty and no possibility. So this exemption applies when it can be seen with certainty that there's no possibility that the activity may have a significant environmental impact. Whether a project qualifies for this kind of exemption is a question of fact. So when an agency is relying on this exemption, it has the burden of showing that substantial evidence supports its determination in applying that exemption, and that was made clear in the Muzzy Ranch decision. An example of where the common sense exemption has been applied is for activities that are designed to improve the environment, such as a revegetation plan. And in fact, this was the court's decision in a 2015 case called Creed 21 versus City of San Diego. Lastly, I'll just say that it is important to note that there may be cases where environmentally protective projects might have environmental impacts. So agencies should carefully consider the application of this common sense exemption. Next slide, please. So there are a number of statutory exemptions in CEQA. This slide shows a partial list of them. In particular, I'm going to just point out two specific activities here on this slide. First, you can see that we've listed ministerial actions. These are actions that are exempt by statute. Ministerial decisions are those that involve little or no personal judgment by the public agency. And we did cover these in the first webinar in the CEQA 202 series, so please look to that webinar for more information. Examples of ministerial activities are the issuance of building permits and building licenses, unless there is some discretionary element in the permitting process. And the other thing that I want to point out on this slide are that there are statutory exemptions for emergency projects, such as projects to replace or repair property that may have been damaged because of a disaster in an area where the governor has declared a state of emergency. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the categorical exemptions. We've listed all of them here. There are 33 of them. We're going to be talking about some of these today that could be used in the housing context. Outside of the housing context, I'll just point out some examples of exempt activities that include actions by regulatory agencies for the protection of natural resources and the environment. So those would be the Class 7 and Class 8 exemptions. There's also the Class 33 exemption. An example where the 7 and 8 have been used is for the local agency's adoption of an ordinance banning plastic bags, which we saw in the Save the Plastic Bag cases. One last thing I'll note here is that when you're looking at the text of categorical exemptions, you may have seen that some have examples of the type of activities that may be covered in that categorical exemption. But we just want to note that the examples given are not generally exclusive ones, and there may be covered activities that are similar to the listed examples. Next slide, please. So where can you find these exemptions? Well, the statutory exemptions are found in the Public Resources Code as well as the CEQA guidelines. And we've listed the sections here on this slide. There are also statutory exemptions outside of CEQA and other statutes. So please that may directly apply to your activity and see if there are any exempt provisions in those other statutes outside of CEQA. Categorical exemptions are found in the CEQA guidelines starting at section 15300. And finally, the common sense exemption is found at CEQA guidelines section 15061, subdivision B3. Next slide, please. The biggest distinction between statutory and categorical exemptions is that statutory exemptions are absolute, whereas categorical exemptions are subject to exceptions. So if one of the exceptions applies, the public agency cannot rely on the categorical exemption. Here we've listed the exceptions to the categorical exemptions. You can find these in CEQA guidelines section 15300.2. And they include number one, if the project is located in a sensitive environment. And as we've noted here, it really only applies to these certain classes 3, 4, 5, 6, and 11. Next, if another exemption is that if there will be significant cumulative impacts from projects of the same type in the same place. Number 3, if there's a reasonable possibility that the project may have a significant environmental impact due to unusual circumstances. And unusual circumstances are generally thought of as being unusual relative to the typical circumstances of an otherwise typically exempt project. Number 4, if the project may damage scenic resources with an official state scenic highway, then the exception may apply there. Another exception is the project is on a listed hazardous waste site. And finally, the last exception is if the project may cause a substantial adverse change in the significance of a historical resource. Next slide. Procedures. So what should an agency do after determining an exemption applies? In general, an agency is not required to file a notice of exemption, but agencies may choose to file one to get the benefit of the shorter statute of limitations, which is 35 days from the date of filing the notice instead of the longer 180 days following the agency's approval. And I'll note that there is no time limit to when the agency has to file the notice of exemption. It just has to be filed, if at all, after the exemption determination is made. You cannot file the NOE before the exemption determination is made. Agencies should also be sure to read the specific exemption that they're relying on, because some of the exemptions expressly do require that the public agency file a notice. Finally, if the lead agency is a state agency, the notice is filed with the state clearinghouse via the CEQA database. And under normal circumstances, local agencies must file these notices, if at all, with the county clerk of the county or counties in which the project is located. Due to the pandemic, however, local agencies in particular should already be aware of the governor's executive orders from last year that provided an alternate way for local agencies to comply with the filing and posting requirements for notices. For the duration of the current state of emergency, instead of filing and posting notices at county clerk's offices pursuant to the executive order, lead agencies can submit notices to the state clearinghouse's CEQA.net database and post them on their websites. If you haven't already seen the executive orders, you can always access them through OPR's CEQA page, as well as the state clearinghouse page. So that is all I have for the table setting. And we are going to move on to our first poll question. So I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Jeannie. I'll go ahead and launch our first poll, which is NOEs. And I will give folks a few seconds to answer the question. Then after that, I will share the results. Here we go. So our first question is, how many NOEs does CEQA.net receive in a typical year? Less than 1,000, between 1,000 and 5,000, between 5,000 and 10,000, or 10,000 plus? I'll go ahead and end the poll now, and these are our results. Looks like 12% chose less than 1,000, 26% chose 1,000 between 5,000, and 5,000 through 10 was 38%, and 25% was 10,000 plus. And Jeannie will go ahead and tell us the correct answer.
So the correct answer is 5,000 to 10,000. So most of us got that answer correct. In 2018, the state clearinghouse received 7,642 NOEs. In 2019, there were 7,677 NOEs. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Holman of HCD.
Thanks, Jeannie and Alyssa. So I'm going to talk about some housing-specific statutory exemptions, some of which can be found in CEQA and some not. And I'm also going to talk about some more general categorical exemptions that may be useful in the context of housing, but aren't specific to housing. Next slide, please. As Jeannie mentioned, there exemptions are all over the place, and I don't have all in the statute, and I don't have time to talk about all of them today. But the ones I will talk about are going to be illustrative. First, I'm going to talk about a few that can be found in the overall umbrella of CEQA's chapter on streamlined environmental review, Article 6. These exemptions aren't broad CEQA exemptions. The statutory exemptions for housing tend to be very specific and highly conditioned, and these are consistent with that. The four I'll talk about are agricultural employee housing, infill housing in unincorporated counties, infill housing in urbanized areas near transit, and low-income housing. Before I talk about those, I feel compelled to remind everyone that they're all very detailed and should be reviewed every time you intend to rely on them. They're quite specific, and my review is going to be somewhat generalized. Next slide, please. All right. So of the four I mentioned, three have shared threshold criteria. The agricultural employee housing, infill housing in urbanized areas near transit, and low-income housing exemptions. And so I'm going to talk about those threshold criteria first, and they'll kind of give you a flavor for how detailed a lot of these exemptions are in the housing realm. So all three of those exemptions have to be consistent with general and local planning documents, with the local zoning code. Some sort of community level environmental review has to have been adopted or certified. And by community level environmental review, that generally means that an EIR, or in some cases a negative declaration, has been adopted for a general plan, community plan, or specific plan, or sometimes certain elements of the general plan. But the guidelines spell this out. They have to be served by utilities and public services or pay all in lieu fees and development fees. They can contain no wetlands, no value as for wildlife habitat, no endangered species, no plants protected under the Native Plant Protection Act, and no species protected by local ordinance. They can't be on the Cortese list. An endangerment assessment has to have been completed, and there are no unmitigated releases of hazardous substances at levels of concern. Can't be with an earthquake or seismic hazard zone or other similar hazards, nor may it be in a flood zone or subject to flood hazards unless the general plan or zoning code contains provisions to mitigate for those risks. There can be no significant effect on historical resources, and these last two are kind of, next two are kind of interesting. They can't have an unusually high risk of fire or explosion due to material stored or used on nearby properties, and they can't present a public health exposure higher than a state standard. And then finally, they can't be located on developed open space or within a state conservancy. And by developed open space, the statute clarifies that means like land that it's been publicly financed or publicly owned and is generally available to the public, but is not substantially developed with structures like playgrounds, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first one I'm going to talk about is agricultural employee housing. To qualify for this exemption, you have to meet those threshold requirements I was talking about a minute ago. It has to be adjacent, at least on two sides, to developed land. It roughly covers 45 units or housing for 45 agricultural employees if you're building dormitory style housing. But if the site is zoned for agriculture, that's limited to 20. There is a 2-acre maximum for areas with higher population density and 5-acre maximum for lower population densities. And all units have to be maintained as affordable to low-income households for at least 15 years. Next slide, please. The next one I'm going to talk about is affordable housing. And again, that has to meet the threshold requirements I talked about earlier. This one authorizes a maximum of 100 units, but that depends to a degree on the surrounding population densities. All units have to be affordable to low-income households for at least 30 years. The project can be on no more than 5 acres. The site has to be in a defined urbanized area of defined size and density. The site must have either been previously developed for qualified urban uses, which means residential, commercial, public, institutional, transit, transportation, passenger facilities, or retail, or combination of those, or is currently surrounded on at least 75% of its sides by parcels that are developed for urban uses. And within the project site, no parcels have been created in the last 10 years. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then of the 3 that are subject to those threshold criteria, this is the last one, residential infill housing in urbanized areas near transit. So the caveat here is, although it has to meet those threshold criteria I talked about earlier, the community level environmental review has to have been adopted or certified within the past 5 years at the time the application is deemed complete. The project has to be on 4 acres or less. It can have no buildings more than 100,000 square feet. It must be on an infill site within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop. No more than 100 units are allowed, and it has to promote higher density infill housing. And that's an interesting concept. It has a certain degree of local control, local definition, but the statute contains a couple of presumptions, one of which is if the project with a density of at least 20 units per acre is conclusively presumed to promote higher density infill housing. And then alternatively, a project with a density of at least 10 units per acre and a greater density than the average density of the residential properties within 1,500 feet shall be presumed as well to promote higher density infill housing. So, but there are also some room for local definition, and it has to have specific affordability requirements, such as, for instance, at least 10% of the housing is sold to families of moderate income, or 10% is rented to families of low income. Or the project can pay in lieu fees. And this exemption is subject to some exceptions. If there's a reasonable possibility the project will have project-specific significant effects due to unusual circumstances, or if the new information or changed circumstances have occurred since the community level environmental environmental review was adopted or certified that affects environmental review, then you can't rely on this exemption. Next slide, please. So this exemption is not subject to those threshold requirements I talked about earlier. This is infill housing in unincorporated counties, areas. It's for multifamily housing and mixed use projects in unincorporated counties, but within the boundaries of an urbanized area or urban cluster. It has to be substantially surrounded, 75%, with qualified urban uses, and the remaining area has to be designated for those urban uses. It has to be consistent with the general plan and zoning, less than 5 acres, and contain at least 6 units because it's multifamily. The exemption contains a complicated formula for required site density in the residential part of the project. And for instance, I'll give you a flavor for it. I won't go into detail. But for instance, it has 3 tests. One of them is the perimeter test. And it says the density of the residential portion of the project can't be less than one of 3 comparisons, including the perimeter test, whichever is greatest. And the perimeter test is the average density of the residential properties, either adjoining or separated by a public right-of-way. I would consult the statute for that kind of specificity. The project site can't have any value as habitat for endangered, rare, or threatened species and must be served by public utilities and services. And the project can have no significant effects relating to transportation, noise, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, or water quality. Subject to the exceptions, and it's subject to the exceptions to categorical exemptions that Jeannie talked about earlier. And one final big caveat is it sunsets in 2025, like many housing statutes. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a bit about housing exemptions in specific to HCD's programs. Well, thank you. And this is about Project Homekey. So exemptions for specific projects are really common in CEQA. You often see like arenas and stadiums. Homekey is a little unusual because it's for a program rather than a specific project like a stadium. The Homekey program was administered by my department using federal funds allocated to the program in June of 2020 with an expenditure deadline of December 2020. The department helped 51 cities and counties acquire more than 6,000 housing units to help those experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, with the goal of not only providing critical shelter, but also slowing the spread of COVID-19. So that was a big ask to get everyone organized and have the expenditure deadline met. The program didn't cap innovation from cities or counties. You know, they had a lot of wiggle room and to be creative. Most proposed adaptive reuses of vacant or underutilized hotels, motels, or apartments, but other projects employed adaptive reuses of other structures or facilities. One tool that was critical to the success of the program was a CEQA exemption that was created just for Homekey. And the CEQA exemption is actually kind of broad compared to the ones we talked about earlier. The CEQA does not apply to any project where Homekey funding was used, where the units were acquired with only public funds. So that was the Homekey funds and maybe local matching funds, and not using eminent domain. So it had to be voluntary purchase. The units will be had to be in safe, decent, and sanitary condition at the time of occupancy, and they had to be covenanted for affordability for 55 years. So that's pretty limited conditioning. But if the project wanted to include rehabilitation, which many did, the work had to be done with the prevailing wage and skilled and trained workforce being paid, and it had to have a letter of support from the lead agency. Typically, that wasn't a problem because the local lead agency was typically also the project proponent. That was the model of the program. And then expansions were allowed, but no more than 10%. And it had to be to support the intended use. So for services, it's access, et cetera. So this exemption was coupled with a streamlining provision in Homekey, which was also quite powerful, where projects were deemed to be consistent and in conformity with applicable local plans, standards, and requirements. And both of those, by the way, you can see from the slide, were in the Health and Safety Code and not in the Public Resources Code. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about some more general categorical exemptions, ones that don't necessarily apply to housing, but that can be useful in the context of housing. And in general, when I was thinking about these, I was thinking how they might apply in the context of accessory dwelling unit law, but that's, just an example. It wouldn't be a limitation. But as many of you may know, the law has expanded its provisions with regard to accessory dwelling units in residential areas. And in many instances, they are subject to ministerial approval, but in some instances they're not, and they're subject to conditional approval, which would trigger CEQA. And I was thinking of these particular exemptions and how they might apply in that context, but of course they might apply in other housing contexts as well. So the first I'm going to talk about is an categorical exemption, the Class 1 exemption, and it applies to existing facilities. It applies to the operation, repair, maintenance, permitting, leasing, licensing, or minor alteration of existing structures and facilities that might be covered by this exemption. And some expansions are allowed. So I can imagine, for instance, that some Homekey projects relied on this exemption. The key is, though, it has to involve negligible or no expansion of existing use. That's a key limitation, and that's been litigated several times in the case law. Next slide, please. The next exemption is a Class 2 exemption. I'm just going to talk about this one really quickly. It involves the replacement or reconstruction of existing structures and facilities where the new structures will be located in the same site as the structure replaced and will have substantially the same purpose and capacity. So that might be utilized in housing. The next slide, please. This one in particular seemed pretty powerful for housing, maybe in the context of ADUs, but in other instances, new construction or conversion of small structures. And so some of you, again, I've been thinking about it in the context of ADU law. ADU law now contains provisions for converting all kinds of structures you might have on your property, such as barns, etc., into housing. And so conceivably, I'm not saying like I'm not giving legal advice, but conceivably this exemption might apply to that, where construction and location of a limited number of new and small facilities or structures, installation of small or new equipment and facilities in small structures, and the conversion of existing small structures from one use to another, where only minor modifications are made to the exterior of the structure. So that seems like that might apply in the context of an ADU, that last provision. Now there are limitations. The number of structures described in the section are the maximum allowed on any legal parcel. And in practical terms, such as this might look like in non-urbanized areas, you might be able to get a single family residence or a accessory dwelling unit in a residential zone, a duplex or a similar multifamily residential structure totaling no more than 4 units, and also some mixed use elements. In urbanized areas, you might be able to convert up to 3 single family residences or construct them. There may be some room to have apartments, duplexes, or similar structures that are designed not more than for not more than 6 dwelling units. And again, there may be some mixed uses allowed. Next slide, please. And the final exemption I think I'm going to talk about, is the Class 32 exemption. The Class 32 exemption is not exclusive to housing, but it applies to infill development generally and can be used for housing. And it just requires that a project be consistent with a local general plan, its land uses and policies, consistent with local zoning code, be within the city limits, be on 5 acres or less, be substantially surrounded by urban uses and served by utilities and public services, not be in an area of value to habitat for endangered, rare, or threatened species, and this is a big caveat, will not result in significant environmental effects relating to traffic, noise, air quality, or water quality. Next slide, please.
And I'll go ahead and launch our second poll on CEQA and housing and give folks a few seconds to share, to answer the question, and then I'll share the results after. Alrighty, and our second question is, according to a recent study, the AEP was the most commonly used CEQA exemption for housing projects. First answer is tiering from specific plans / community plans. The second answer is infill exemptions. The third answer is transit priority projects. And the fourth answer is affordable housing. Give folks a couple more seconds. Alrighty, it looks like majority of people have answered the poll. I'll go ahead and end and share results. Looks like 21% said tiering from specific plans / community plans, 57% said infill and exemptions, 6% said transit priority projects, and 17% said affordable housing. And Jennifer will go ahead and share the answer.
Thanks, Alyssa. So most of us are correct. 57% got the right answer. The correct answer is infill exemptions under class 32. That was the last one I talked about. A fun fact, while most exemptions occur under that class 32 exemption, most units, the largest number of units, are actually developed under tiering from specific and community plans, but not the most number of exemptions cited. So thank you, Alyssa.
All right. And now I'm going to be talking about new exemptions and tools that we wanted folks to be aware of. So first we want to talk about SB 288, which was signed into law last year and is a fairly broad exemption for sustainable transportation projects. It was authored by Senator Wiener, and it covers projects including complete streets, bike lanes, certain transit projects, and any acts by the local government to remove minimum parking requirements. And those are a statutory exemption. There are special requirements for projects over $100 million. They have to do a business case and a racial equity analysis. And it also extends and simplifies an existing exemption that was in CEQA statute for bike plans. So that is now extended out for a longer period of time, and some of the requirements have been removed. So it is simpler and easier to use. OPR is in the process of preparing a technical advisory on all of the CEQA exemptions available for sustainable transportation projects, and we expect to release that this summer. So stay tuned for that. One of the things it will do is provide a little bit more guidance about how to do that business case and racial equity analysis for those projects over $100 million, since that was required by the statute. I also wanted to note that the 2018 amendments to the CEQA guidelines changed some of the language in Class 1, which Jennifer has already gone over about existing facilities, that makes it clear that you can use a Class 1 exemption for projects that involve existing highways and streets, sidewalks, gutters, bicycle and pedestrian trails, as long as you're not expanding it and creating additional automobile lanes, but you're just kind of reorganizing how the street is used, and adding like bike facilities, bike parking, and bus lanes, pedestrian crossings. All of that could be covered conceivably by the Class 1 categorical exemption. So be sure to check that out the next time you have one of those projects, and stay tuned for OPR's technical advisory on this topic, which will have more information. The next tool I wanted to cover is something called SiteCheck. Some of you may have heard about this. We launched it in beta format back in August of last year. This tool was funded by HCD and developed by OPR in working with Conservation Biology Institute, who did all of the technology for us and data collection. We are wrapping up the beta period fairly soon and beginning the work to update the tool for our version 1.0 launch. So we wanted to bring it to your attention again, just in case you haven't had a chance to check it out and want to provide OPR with any feedback on the tool, because now is the time that we can use that feedback to improve it before it's officially launched. So with that, I'm going to show you a little bit about what the tool can do with maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes, so we can leave a little bit of time for questions. So if you go to SiteCheck, you will end up on a page that looks like this. And the website, once again, is sitecheck.opr.ca.gov if you want to follow along. So before you can do anything else, you have to accept the disclaimer that says we're not providing you with legal advice. And then you get on this About page. So here it will tell you a little bit more about the tool and what it can do. There's also a help button up in the top. So if we go through this a little bit quickly today and you want more information, check the About and check the Help. And then there's the ability down here at the bottom to provide us with feedback. And that's what we would really love during this phase, is your feedback on how we can improve the tool. So I'm going to quickly go over the 3 main functions, and you can see them here: layers, screen, and analyze. So the first one I'm going to cover is layers. It's pretty straightforward. It's what you would expect. It puts layers on the map. So as you heard in Jennifer's presentation, a lot of the requirements in the exemptions have certain spatial requirements, like it must be in an urbanized area, or it must be within a certain proximity of a transit stop. So we really wanted to make it easier for folks to understand where those areas were, since it can be difficult to figure that out from the statutory language. So if you are using that statutory exemption for unincorporated areas, that uses this definition here for urbanized area from the census. If you're using the other ones in 21159 that Jennifer mentioned, that uses this definition in 21071. So you can see what that looks like. We didn't cover SB 226, but that has an even different definition of urban area, and you can see that as well. So for true CEQA nerds, you can kind of compare those and see really how different the definitions of urbanized area are within CEQA. And then you also have the ability to look at areas that are covered by specific plans, different transit definitions, and then also environmental constraints. And you can also change the base layer down here at the bottom if you wanted more of a satellite view. That's an option. I will note this is in beta format, so some of our data sets are not complete. So for example, if you click on some of the planned transit, you'll see that we really at this time only have good information for Sacramento. So that area lights up, but a lot of areas don't. That doesn't mean that there isn't planned transit in those areas. It's just because we're in beta format at this time. So when it's fully launched in version 1.0, you'll see a complete map of those areas. The next function I wanted to go over is this screen function. And I think this is a little bit less intuitive, but it's actually my favorite function of the tool. It allows you to find parcels that meet certain criteria. So the tool is really designed around CEQA, but you could use this function for grant programs, other legislation, proposed legislation, just to really get a sense of what parcels meet the various criteria that is included in any of those. So here you can see these are the parcels that are covered by a specific plan. So if you knew that you wanted to use the exemption for housing projects that are covered by a specific plan and you wanted to see where those specific plans were, you could use this to find that. This is another data set that we are slowly acquiring. So for example, it doesn't include the downtown specific plan right now, but it will in version 1.0. So I'm sure a few people in the audience will recognize that. But then let's say you have your specific plans up and you're like, I actually would like to use the exemption in 21155.4, which is a little bit stronger, and it's not just covered by a specific plan, but you also have to be within a half mile of an existing major transit stop. And then you see that your options go down quite a bit. We can zoom in to kind of see, what are those remaining parcels that are both covered by a specific plan, but are also within a half-mile of an existing major transit stop. So that's how the tool works. The more filters you add, the fewer parcels are going to show up. And once again, we also have those environmental constraint layers in there as well. But this is obviously just to give you a sense of where these might be. You would still have to do your due diligence and check local site conditions for things like species, and wildfire and landslide hazards. All right, but the real meat and potatoes of the tool is this final tab, the Analyze tab. And so that allows you to select a parcel and then run a report. So here I've typed in 440 Arden Way up here, and that gave me the option to select this parcel. And this is actually a parcel that is part of our Excess State Sites program. It's currently used as an armory by the California National Guard, but it's going to be converted to affordable housing as part of the governor's executive order on excess state sites. So if OPR and HCD were working on this site and we wanted to know, what CEQA streamlining options are available for this site, we would simply select it. And that moves it over here into what I think of as the shopping cart. Another thing to note is you can actually select nearby properties as well and merge them together to form one project. So if this project wasn't just this parcel, but this one as well, that's fine. We can merge those together and analyze them as one. And then you simply hit Create Report, and it works for a little bit and then pops up with a report that goes into more detail. And essentially a check mark means that the tool thought that the spatial requirements for the streamlining option might be met. A question mark means that the streamlining provision either doesn't have any spatial requirement, but we always wanted it to come up as an option, or that we want folks to do a little bit more due diligence on that. So right now you'll see it for any of the streamlining that requires covered by a specific plan, because I mentioned earlier, we're still in the process of compiling that data source. And so we don't want to tell anyone at this stage that you're not covered by a specific plan, because you certainly could be. And then of course, an X means you did not meet the spatial requirements. You'll see that there's a lot of information provided here, both on statutory exemptions, categorical exemptions, and then streamlining, which we defined as provisions that aren't a full exemption from CEQA, but could just reduce the level of analysis that you have to do. And so I'm going to quickly go through one of these so you can see what that looks like for an exemption we haven't covered, which is the SB 375 transit priority projects. So if I click on this little arrow, it will expand it out. And then I can scroll through and see the requirements. So the first, it has to be within an MPO, which is met here. If there are multiple ways to meet a spatial requirement, which we tried to note that. So here for transit proximity, you see that it could be near rail transit on a high quality transit corridor or near planned transit. This particular site's not actually within a quarter of a mile of a high quality transit corridor, but because it meets one of the other criteria, transit is satisfied. And then it goes through those environmental constraints, wetlands, riparian areas, habitat. And for each criteria, we also try to include the definitions that might be helpful for that. So you have everything in one place. You're not having to go through the CEQA statute and the guidelines and any appendices trying to combine this information together. We really wanted this to be as helpful of a resource as possible. The downside of that is it's a very long report. So, it's hard to do both, but hopefully we've struck a balance. If not, please note that in your feedback. As you go through, you'll see the spatial requirements, and then there's the requirements that are not spatial, but we still wanted to include, and the way that they're listed is, these hollow bubbles that could be checked if the report is printed. So if you're a planner, an attorney, a developer, you can kind of go through and say, well, now that I think those spatial requirements are met, what about the remaining requirements? Do I think I can meet those as well? Is this a viable path for me for CEQA compliance? And then you can see there's still quite a bit for this one. This is one of the longer exemptions contained in the CEQA statute. But we tried to make it as easy as possible to understand what all of those requirements were. Still going through. And then the last thing I want to note, you can download the report by clicking up here in the corner. And when you do, it will include not just that report, but also other resources that might be helpful for you in navigating the tool. And at any point in using the tool, if you hit create link, it'll create a unique link that will take you to that exact thing that you're looking at. So if you are wanting to share with a client or an applicant what the tool is showing you, just zoom in on what you want them to see, hit create link, and you will be able to quickly show them what you would like them to see. All right, and then we'll go back to our last poll, Alyssa, if you can.
Thanks, Natalie. I'll go ahead and launch our last poll, which is on SB 35. And as before, I'll give folks a couple seconds to go ahead and answer the poll, and then I will share results after. And the question for our last poll is SB 35 provides a by right approval process for certain housing projects. Is SB 35 a CEQA exemption?
I think we can end polling a little bit earlier on this one because we are running short on time. So what are the results, Alyssa?
Looks like 42% said yes and 58% said no.
All right. I will admit this is kind of a trick question because people go both ways on it. But you know, at OPR, we say that the answer is no. It's not a CEQA exemption because it completely removes a project from the discretionary approval process. So CEQA is never triggered. But as was mentioned earlier in the presentation, there is language in 21080 that says ministerial projects are exempt from CEQA. So it's a bit confusing because I think of it as you can't get past step one, is it a project, unless it's discretionary. But if somehow you do and you're down on the is it exempt, you'll find once again that ministerial projects are exempt. All right, and that's the end of my portion.
Great. Well, thank you so much for our panelists in that presentation. We have a few minutes here to go through some Q&A, and there, with the site check portion, there was a number of questions related to site check. So I want to just kick it off with a few of those. Natalie, if you could, how is the environmental constraint for historical, cultural, or tribal cultural resources handled in site check?
Yeah, so we don't actually have that mapped within site check. Okay. So, you know, it comes up if it is something you have to consider as part of the exemption, as part of that non-spatial list that will have to be determined by the user. But at this time, we did not map the historical or cultural sites as part of the mapping portion of the tool.
Two more on site check. Is it possible to export data sets or shapefiles from the site check tool?
Yeah, actually. So thank you for that question. I was going through so quickly, I didn't note that. But if you go to the layers tab, off to the side, you'll see a little icon that looks like, I think it's a few different animals in a blue circle. That's actually the logo for Databasin, which is run by Conservation Biology Institute, who created the tool. And if you click on that, it'll take you to Databasin. And as long as the data set is not proprietary, you have the option to download it and use it for your own purposes. Because this is a publicly funded tool, we wanted to make the information as publicly available as possible. But there were times when there were proprietary constraints that made it so we could not actually make that layer downloadable.
And one more on site check is is there an ability to add custom layers from our jurisdiction or from the jurisdiction to analyze projects that might not be tied to specific parcels or otherwise are used to signify potential environmental impacts?
Not at this time, but that is something that comes up very often and we're looking at for future phases. Through another project that OPR is working on with the military, we will have the ability to easily get data from local jurisdictions. And we're hoping that once that technology is in place through that tool, we'll be able to incorporate it into SiteCheck as well, because we have heard that it would be helpful for users to be able to import their own data into the tool.
And one more just came in across the line on SiteCheck. Does the mapping tool take into consideration small cities and rural areas away from major urban centers of the state?
Yes, so we try to make sure that the tool could be used statewide. Obviously, there are some provisions that are specific to urbanized areas or places near transit that might have more applicability in urban areas, but there's others like covered by a specific plan or within city boundaries like Class 32 that would still apply in those smaller, more rural jurisdictions, and that will show up on the map.
Well, thanks for that, and it looks like an amazing tool. Jumping back to some of the questions that came in over the Q&A, with respect, and I think that Natalie, we're going to stick with you on this one. With respect to the Class 32 categorical exemption for infill development, any guidance on what a substantially surrounded by and urban uses mean in subsection B?
Yeah, that's a good question because there really isn't. So you'll see in other sections, in the definition section of CEQA, there's more information about what a qualified urban use is, but that's not the phrase that's used within Class 32. It's just urban uses. So the agency does have a little bit more discretion there than they do in the ones that rely on the infill definition and qualified urban uses as part of that. There is one case out of San Diego that kind of looked at this, what does it mean to be substantially surrounded, and said that it could be 3/4. The court didn't really make a determination on that, but that's the best guidance we have. And I'm blanking on that case name, but if Jeannie and Jennifer remember, they might be able to chime in. But that's the only thing I'm aware of that looked explicitly at what does substantially surrounded by urban uses mean in the Class 32 context. I think at Balboa Park, maybe. A big part of the case was whether the park itself counted as an urban use.
Interesting. Okay, I think we're going to head to the last slide after that question.
Okay.
So thank you everybody for joining today. We got a lot of questions and a few ideas for future webinars. Thank you so much. We know we were not able to get to everybody's questions, so we wanted to just provide people with links to tools and resources on OPR's website, as well as HCD's website regarding CEQA and exemptions and SB 35. So the links are here. We got a lot of questions asking whether the PowerPoint would be posted online, and we intend to do so. So you'll have all of these code sections and resources available to you. And I'm just going to hand it back over to Matt to wrap it up.
Well, thanks so much, Jeannie, and thanks for everyone for participating as panelists and for joining as attendees. Really appreciate this and looking forward to having you join us for future webinars on CEQA and working with us. So much appreciation, and thanks to Alyssa for the seamless management, and much appreciation to Jennifer Holman from HCD as well for joining us today. So with that, I think we're going to